Chapter 6 of The Fortune Hunter, a novel of New York society. The ballroom opens. More. Car hélas, dans nos salons, où la foule est si grande, qui sait de l'ours, sous les brillances de rose d'un plaisir de commande, où sont nos cours? Esther Clinton stood at her mirror, in a fanciful yet tasteful ballroom attire. She contemplated, with more than usual animation, the really beautiful features reflected before her. By her side, Rachel, forgetful of her own dishabille, was smoothing a fold here, fastening a flower there, knotting a ribbon, or twisting a curl.
"Sprinkle a little water on my hair. These ringlets do not fall loosely enough," said Esther. "Oh, no, sister, pray let them be. If they fall about your shoulders entirely uncurled, it gives you such a slovenly appearance. To your eyes, which find something slovenly in careless grace, but not to those of others, sprinkle the water, or I shall do it myself."
Rachel obeyed, and the ringlets untwined themselves at her touch, leaving a mass of waving hair around the face and throat of their fair possessor, which gave her the Ophelia-like appearance she desired. "You are quite ready now, Esther, are you not?"
"Yes, let us go. I wonder if Miss Arria has invited Mr. Brainard. She is acquainted with the Chadwicks, is she? Is the carriage here?"
"I believe so. I have not commenced my own toilette yet, but I shall complete it while you are putting on your gloves. How beautifully you look!" Rachel ran out of the room, speedily exchanged her wrapper for a dress of unadorned white, smoothed back her fine and abundant hair, saying to herself, "No matter, nobody will look at me, and I must not keep Esther waiting," and returned to her sister. As she entered the room, Mrs. Clinton was holding Esther's hands, turning her around to survey her graceful contour, and kissing her forehead, cheeks, and lips, with every token of affectionate admiration. Rachel came forward rather timidly and said, "Good-bye, mother." "Are you ready?" "Good-bye," replied Mrs. Clinton, imprinting another kiss upon Esther's lips, and turning away from her elder daughter. Rachel was incapable of envy, but she longed for a return of the affection which animated her own bosom. As Esther drew her cloak around her, Rachel once more approached her mother and tenderly kissed her for adieu. The cold pressure of the lip which met hers in return chilled her heart and damped her spirits. She entered the carriage in silence, and none saw the tear that stood in her eye. None knew the emotions that she forced herself to control. The flash of lights, the swell of music, the hum of mirthful voices soon banished all disturbing thoughts. Rachel's countenance was perfectly serene before she entered the ballroom with Esther. They were greeted by their vivacious hostess with a flood of questions, to none of which, however, a reply was needed or expected. Miss Arria was all animation and excitement and agitation. The hue of her face strongly resembled that of the scarlet folds of her red and green turban. Her portly form was compressed into a robe of crimson velvet, until its proportions might almost have been called elegant. Her arms and ears and neck were encumbered with more jewels than an Indian queen would have thought it convenient to carry, and her robe was covered with a quantity of rich lace, for which it must have puzzled Mademoiselle Armand's inventive genius to have found a place. Her eyebrows looked several shades darker than usual, her teeth as many shades whiter, and her light, woolly-looking hair was frizzed about her small gray eyes into double its ordinary tangle. She fluttered about among her guests, dispensing smiles and queries with lavish profusion, on restless tiptoe hovering, giggling with all the gallants that beset her. To the gentleman she was especially courteous, but the arm which she accepted with most pleasure, and which she called upon most frequently to assist her in traversing the room, was that of Mr. Brainard. When Esther Clinton entered the room, this gentleman found some difficulty in dividing himself equally between the two fair ones. But Mr. Ellery was the Solomon who assisted him in the just distribution, and encouraged him when his attention flagged with the warning of, "Remember, both your birds are yet in the bush. Keep an eye on them, or one may fly." While Brainard was engaged in procuring Miss Adair a glass of lemonade, she turned to Esther, who was standing with clasped hands and pendant arms, gazing abstractedly on the convivial scene, and addressed her. "Have you been long acquainted with Mr. Brainard, Miss Esther?" Esther started, looking wildly about her, then solemnly replied, "Long? No, not long, as ordinary mortals compute time, yet how long in reality?" "Don't you think him handsome?" "Yes." "How old is he?" "I know not." "He is rich, is he not?" "In wealth which the gods love." "But Mr. Ellery says he has a large fortune, does he not?" "Yes," replied Esther, sinking again into reverie. "Has he any family connections here?" No reply. "Do you not like the color of his eyes?" Still no answer. "Do you not think that he—" "Will Miss Adair accept this refreshing draught from the hands of her obedient Mr. Brainard's eye accidentally fell on Esther, and he stopped short, abruptly concluding his sentence with a bow. Esther believed him to be so perfectly engrossed by his passion for her that a suspicion of his ever wasting a thought upon any other person never entered her mind, not even when he asked her if her lovely friend Miss Walton would not add one more charm to the company by her presence in their gay assembly that night. "What Miss Walton?" questioned Miss Adair, who overheard him. "The niece of a Mr. Mordaunt," answered Brainard. "What Mordaunt?" "He is a lawyer, I believe." "Is he a widower?" "No, he is unfortunate enough to be a bachelor," replied Brainard, with the fellow feeling which makes us kind. "Is he rich?" "I think not." "Where are the parents of Miss Walton?" "Both dead." "Is she pretty?" Brainard was about to give a rapturous description of the fair Arria's charms, but prudence made him an opportune suggestion, and he replied with apparent indifference, "Some persons think her so." "Where does she live?" "In 8th Street with a Mr. and Mrs. Lemming." "The Lemmings! Oh, I know Mrs. Lemming quite well. Is it the young girl living with them that you are talking about? Quite a suspicious character. I never have anything to do with such people. The girl can never be admitted into good society. I should not consider her a proper person to visit." Mr. Brainard looked at Esther as though he hoped she would defend her friend, but she appeared to be wholly engrossed by her own reflections. "I must rouse her," thought Brainard. "This will never do. I must be making more progress, or when shall I bring matters to a conclusion? How I dodged about to escape that eternal badger today! I must make one desperate push to rid myself of that fellow. I'll do it tonight." With this determination Brainard offered his arm to Esther, and declaring that the apartment was too warm for so fragile a creature, drew her toward the supper-room. It was empty, for supper had not yet been announced, but the table was spread with every imaginable delicacy. Brainard chose a rosy-cheeked love-apple that lay embedded among bunches of luscious grapes, and presented it to Esther, saying, "Lovely Estelle, were I a Paris, I would award the golden apple of beauty to the only—" "Mr.
Brainard! Mr. Brainard! I have been looking all over for you."
Mr. Brainard turned and encountered the searching glance of Miss Priscilla Adair. "I am ever at your service," he said with alacrity. "I really thought Miss Estelle looked faint, and although supper had not yet been served, I took the liberty of luring her here to procure some refreshment." Miss Priscilla looked but half satisfied with this excuse, and accepted the disengaged arm of Brainard, while Esther hung on the other. "What shall I do with these two divine creatures?" muttered Brainard to himself, looking first on one side, then the other. "Which shall I select for my wife? Whichever will have me, of course. Too much the beggar, Mr. Augustus Brainard, to be the chooser. And now to get rid of one, it matters little which. How happy could I be with either? 'Twere the other dear charmer away." Mr. Brainard was just beginning to hum an appropriate air from the Beggar's Opera, when the master of ceremonies' command of "Gentlemen, take your partners," fortunately checked him. Brainard requested the hand of Miss Priscilla, but, as she thought it advisable to refuse, he contented himself with leading Mrs. Ester to the head of the cotillion. It has been the complaint of foreigners, on visiting New York, that fashionable society is chiefly led by young girls just escaped from the confinement of boarding schools, and young men whom the dancing master has fitted for a ballroom, but who have never fitted themselves for any other sphere. The married gentlemen at a party herd together, and discuss the rise and fall in stocks, while the married ladies, be their charms, grace, and information what they may, bloom in rows along the walls of the apartment, totally deserted by younger gentlemen, and only now and then receiving a word or an ice cream from their legal protectors. The circle of wallflowers is greatly increased by belles who have danced through a few seasons without obtaining a partner for life. And here Rachel Clinton took a seat, watching the dancers with as pleased an expression of countenance as though she was moving to the enlivening sound of the music among them. Her strange determination to renounce the name and privileges of an heiress had speedily rumored about, and, as she expected, her admirers no longer beheld anything about her on which to bestow their flattery, and her suitors had been suddenly frightened by her coldness, and pronounced her heart too obdurate for further siege. That evening she had been following Esther about from room to room, arranging her dress whenever it became discomposed, mourning over her dishevelled locks, concealing her ridiculous speeches by giving them some ingenious interpretation, and rousing her from her reveries when they attracted the attention of the malicious. Esther was now dancing, and Rachel, supposing she would not need her services until the close of that cotillion, seated herself beside a talkative old lady who was chaperoning two nieces, and entered into the conversation. "How remarkably well Miss Adair looks tonight," observed Rachel, addressing the old lady.
"Yes," replied the lady, "she is dashing out of late. We are to have a grand supper, I hear. It is hardly time for it yet, for my nephews have not come. They always know the supper hour and arrive just in time."
"I have heard that Miss Adair intends giving a fancy ball. Do you suppose there is any truth in that report?"
"Very likely. The fact is, she is determined to settle herself this winter. Do you not mention it to anybody, but between you and me she has found out that it is high time."
"Well, yes, if she intends to marry, I suppose that she is old enough to choose with discretion," replied Rachel good-humoredly.
"Oh, I don't allude to her years. A husband is not all that she wants. She must have a rich one. I ought not to mention it, for it is quite a secret, but then you are such a judicious young person, Miss Rachel, that I am sure that it will not go any further. You know Miss Adair has two brothers, Benjamin and Joseph. Well, they do
say, but whether it is true or not I can't exactly answer, that those brothers who had the sole management of her fortune have invested it almost all in fancy stocks, and speculated so largely that they have quite ruined her. So to save herself from poverty, for you know both brothers are as poor as Job's turkey, she intends to get herself a rich husband." "I sincerely hope the report is not true," replied Rachel, with an expression of sympathy. "Don't mention it for the world," replied her informer. "You see, it was my nephew who told me, and it might get him into trouble if it got wind." "The report shall gain no circulation through me," returned Rachel. "What report, my dear Miss Clinton?" asked Mr. Ellery, who at that instant approached her. "Oh, none of any consequence, only a bit of scandal, such as you know we ladies delight in." "I never knew that before, that Miss Rachel Clinton delighted in scandal. But I must not forget my mission. I come to request permission to present you to Mr. Allen, who desires an introduction to Miss Clinton." "To my sister, he means. The cotillion is just finishing. You will find her in the next room." "No, it was to you. There is no mistake. He pointed you out." "There may be a mistake in spite of that," replied Rachel, her lip curling almost scornfully. "Perhaps it is to Miss Clinton, the heiress, he wishes to be presented, and supposes that I am still she." "No, I assure you. He noticed you some time ago, when you were standing by Miss Ester. He has been talking to me about you since, and as a mere matter of conversation, I informed him of your extraordinary determination. As he really desires an introduction, I hope you will not refuse it." "I have no excuse for doing so." Mr. Ellery bowed and went in search of the gentleman. "Whom did he say, my dear?" inquired the lady with whom she had been conversing. "Mr. Allen, I believe." "Is it possible? A fine young man, but exceedingly strange in his manner towards ladies. They call him the woman-hater, because he hardly ever addresses a lady. He has just returned from travelling in Europe. He is a young man of immense fortune. Do pray take an opportunity to introduce him to my nieces." "I will not forget to do so." Before Rachel could say any more, Mr. Ellery returned, conducting a rather diffident-looking but very handsome young man, whom he presented to her as Mr. Allen. Rachel's habitual forgetfulness of self, united to an amiable desire to give pleasure, usually made her an agreeable companion in society, but in this instance she became exceedingly cold and taciturn. She saw that Mr. Allen was handsome and gentlemanly, and soon discovered him to be well informed and a skilful student of human nature. She could not fathom the motives which induced him to request a presentation to her. He asked her to dance, and she was too fond of the exercise to refuse, but little of her attention during the quadrille was devoted to her partner. When it closed, she remembered her promise to the old lady, and presented Mr. Allen to her nieces. He entered into conversation with him, but when Rachel moved away, he immediately followed her, and continued at her side the rest of the evening. Immediately after supper, Rachel and Esther withdrew. Brainard conducted Esther to the carriage, pressing her fingers and saying something about the moon, which was shining in their faces as he bid her adieu. Rachel was led by Mr. Allen. As the carriage door closed, he politely requested that she would permit him the pleasure of calling upon her. She was so much surprised at his whole conduct that, although looking him full in the face, the carriage drove off without her according the permission he desired. Mrs. Clinton was awaiting them in the parlor when they reached home. "Have you been lonely without us, mother?" asked Rachel. "Oh, not at all. I had a most delightful visit from Mrs. Chadwick. She says that if anybody in the world can cure me of my tic douloureux, it is her husband, and I intend to send for him tomorrow. She is a delightful woman, and has such affection for my sweet Estelle.
For me, mother, we have but seldom met.
That does not make any difference. Of course she has heard all about you from her son. From what she says, I am inclined to think he is desperately in love with you, and after all the anecdotes she has related to me about him, I really do not know a young man I would rather have for a son-in-law. Do you intend to be as cruel as usual, my own Estelle?
I am so often forced to be cruel, but to him I fear I never could be, though it would break the heart of another who loves me as well, but less wisely.
My dear mother, interrupted Rachel, I am quite sure you must have misunderstood Mrs. Chadwick. Edgar is in love, but not with my sister.
Rachel, Rachel, exclaimed Esther, lifting her hands and eyes to heaven, this from you!
You do not flatter yourself that he comes here to see you yourself, I hope? Demanded Mrs. Clinton with some asperity. You do not suppose it is you he is in love with? Far from it, mother. I have no such thought. He is in love with Arria Walton. Esther looked at Rachel without surprise and merely answered,
You have not seen his heart as I have.
What nonsense you talk, Rachel, said her mother. I understood Mrs. Chadwick perfectly well, and she gave me to understand that her son was in love with Estelle. Do you not suppose I have ears and some comprehension? Go to bed now, and do not say any more about it. It is Estelle he loves, and he has made a good choice. I shall not sleep this night until I get your father to think favorably of the match. That Mrs. Chadwick is such a delightful woman. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. O joyful heart, exult not so, mistrust that prospect fair. It is the lure of death and woe, the ambush of despair. Epps Sargent. There is a happiness communicated by the presence of the happy. Our own faces spontaneously reflect the sunshine of the faces before us. Our own hearts irresistibly echo the clear, joyous tones that burst from the lips to which we are listening. So thought Rachel as she sat in Arria's little chamber, looked into Arria's beaming countenance, and responded to the sprightly remarks for which the most trifling circumstances seemed to give occasion. "Shall our friendship be less strong," asked Rachel after a moment's silence, "when you are a wife, Arria?" "Not unless matrimony unnaturally contracts my heart, instead of expanding it as it would naturally do." "And you have determined to marry young Chadwick?" "With your gracious permission," returned Arria, bowing in mock submission. "But your uncle has not yet given his consent?" "Nor withheld it, for it has not yet been asked. I wished Edgar to talk with him when he is in a mood to give and forgive, but no favorable opportunity has yet offered itself. Do you not feel some anxiety?" "Not in the least. The worst thing to take on interest is trouble. Do you not remember that Shakespeare says, 'Cowards die many times before their death'? So the anticipator of evil is afflicted with 1,000 evils that herald the one he dreaded." "That is a very happy philosophy. But I have a question to ask you. How can you, with your peculiar and confirmed religious views, marry a man whose ideas on such subjects are so unsettled as Edgar Chadwick's? He has no fixed belief even in the existence of a supreme being, or in the immortality of the soul, and its future happiness or misery."
but he has in his own soul the rich soil in which the seed may be planted, and I would marry him to turn sower. What greater happiness can I have than in that of convincing his reason of the holy truths in which I myself believe?
You follow the doctrine of St. Paul, then, in that a good wife sanctifieth her husband.
If she sanctifies him, it is in engrafting her goodness upon him, and by making him a participator of it through his sympathy with her. You have sometimes heard me speak of the influence of one person's fear upon another person. I have reason to think that when a being loves God, and therefore earnestly desires to become pure and perfect as he is, that being, if he also loves mankind, the good for their goodness, the evil, that he may turn them to goodness, carries about him a sphere of love, which affects and softens the heart of those with whom he communicates, that we are encircled by a spiritual sphere, through the medium of which we affect others, has become the belief of many wise and great men. Have you never yourself, in the presence of some individuals, felt a sensation of inward cold and depression, as though your faculties were all paralyzed, accompanied sometimes with a feeling of inexplicable repugnance? And have you not, in the presence of others, felt your heart grow warm, as though it were alive to every impression, while at the same time your spirits had free play? I may not have experienced precisely the sensation you described, although I have often felt ill at ease and constrained in every movement in the society of some strangers, while I could converse freely and take pleasure in the presence of others, and this without being able to account for in my own emotion. The presence of those I love always communicates pleasure, if they are pleased, and pain, if they are suffering. But to return to the subject of Mr. Chadwick. He is certainly a very moral young man, and perhaps you think morality is sufficient. Excellent, but not sufficient. To be truly good, he must neither break moral or divine laws, and from love of goodness, which is from love of God, and to love God he must know him and have communion with him in spirit. If he performs a good act through the love of display, to obtain a reward, or to win praise, or for any other consideration than because it is pleasing to heaven and in his own soul, the act is not pure, because there is impurity in the motive. If a man through morality abstained from evil, would you not call him good, although he is denied the existence of a God? He may abstain from committing evil deeds from the fear of losing his reputation, or from the dread of the consequences to himself, and in such case there would be no virtue in his motives, therefore none in his act. If he committed a sin in thought, although he dared not commit that sin in deed, he would be equally guilty in the sight of heaven, which judges the action of the spirit rather than those of the body. But if he abstained from sin for the fear of injuring others, or because he felt it to be a crime, he might not acknowledge God openly, but internally he must have acknowledged him, since he kept his commandment. So it is with Edgar Chadwick. His mind appears to me pure for the love of purity, and though the existence of the deity has never proved to him, and therefore he does not believe it, he is in a state of reception, and will not close his eyes upon the truth when it is presented to him. He will thoroughly investigate, and to investigate is to believe. Therefore it is that I do not fear to become his wife, and that I look forward to promoting his happiness in the one way through which it can alone be ensured. I myself have enjoyed the advantages to which he has been a stranger, and to them I am indebted for the inestimable blessings of faith. I am afraid I have evinced but little humility in all that I have just said, and if you condemn me, you will condemn me justly. But prosperity and happiness make us— Arria Walton! Broke in the harsh voice of Mrs. Lemming. Arria started up and ran to obey the summons. Come down here, Miss Arria,
called out Mrs. Lemming from the foot of the stairs. "Dr. Chadwick desires to see you." "I will come immediately," replied Arria, re-entering the chamber. "What can Dr. Chadwick possibly have to say to me? Did you ever see such a foolish girl, Rachel? What will you think has become of my boasted philosophy when you see me so excited without a shadow of a cause? We good preachers are, after all, bad practisers. Make yourself at home until I come back. I am sure the doctor will pronounce me to have been seized with a scarlet fever, for my fingers have grown red. Look out for the patient." Arria hastened to the parlor. When she entered, she found Mr. Lemming standing near the door, apparently about to leave the room. He had paused to say a few more words to Dr. Chadwick, who was sitting near the window, with the head of his cane pressed against his lips, and his eyes bent upon the ground. Arria remarked with surprise the solemn, even stern expression of Lemming's habitually mild and benevolent countenance. 2 crimson spots burnt brightly on his hollow cheeks, which were generally overspread with the pallor of thought and study. His eyes were bright and restless. The long silvery locks that usually waved smoothly around his high forehead stood up in tangled masses, as though his agitated fingers had been unconsciously hurried through them. The seldom ruffled serenity of his mien had given way to an air of excited indignation. When his eye rested on Arria, he seized her hand, and grasping it convulsively with his own, whispered, "God give you strength, my child. Let not all the lessons I have taught you be in vain." He bent toward her, hurriedly kissed her forehead, and left the room. Before Arria had time to reflect on the strangeness of his manner, Dr. Chadwick arose, and, courteously saluting Arria, led her to a seat. This perfect composure and the gallant suavity of his manners quickly reassured her, and she entered into the conversation with her usual graceful ease. The doctor at first answered somewhat abstractly, but after a few moments he drew his chair closer to her, once more applied his cane thoughtfully to his mouth, took her hand, looked at her with parental tenderness, and, clearing his throat, as if he were afraid his words would not be distinct, addressed her. "My dear Miss Walton, my dear young lady, I have something very particular to communicate, that is, to consult you, to talk with you about this morning." Arria smilingly expressed her readiness to listen to him. "My dear young lady, I presume you are aware of, that is to say, you have suspected, or have been apprised of the fancy, the penchant, as the French call it, the penchant of which my son entertains for you?" Dr. Chadwick cleared his throat as he finished uttering these words, with more strength, success, and evident satisfaction than had attended any of his previous attempts. The rosy blood mantled over Arria's cheeks. One moment her dark eyes were veiled by their darker lashes, the next they were raised confidingly to the doctor's face. That look was sufficient to answer his question. It almost discomposed the doctor, and would have shaken his purpose had that purpose been less firm, but he steeled his heart and continued with less deliberation. "My dear Miss Arria, I must consider myself duty bound to give you a fair statement of the case. My son is a young man, a very young man, and hardly knows his own mind on any subject. He has had no experience in the world, and does not know what it is to struggle through it. You are in the same condition. It is my opinion that 2 young persons uniting themselves under these circumstances will have many trials to undergo, which you are, neither of you, calculated to sustain." Dr. Chadwick paused, as though he half expected Arria would divine his meaning, and answer, with dignity, that she would never marry a man against the consent of his parents. He was mistaken, however, for her tone was full of affectionate gratitude as she answered, "You are very good to think of these things, but we have thought of them too, and on my account you need have no uneasiness. I can endure privations and hardships. I should not consider any trial too formidable by the side of Edgar." But it is not on your account only, returned Dr. Chadwick, rather warmly. Do you not suppose that I have some consideration for the happiness of my son? Do you not suppose that I wish to see him fighting all his days with poverty, getting the worst of the battle in the end because he is encumbered by a wife in the same situation as himself? Arria looked aghast, and her lip quivered so violently that it impeded her utterance. She could with difficulty reply, "But if he is content?" "That is not enough, my dear young lady, not by any means enough. I hope you will hear me calmly, for I have only one word to say, which is, that there is an insurmountable barrier to your union with my son." "Can poverty be so insurmountable a barrier?" replied Arria, with more calmness. "He does not think so. I do not, and therefore I have pledged him my hand, which I cannot withdraw unless it is his wish, and much as I would ever lament your opposition to our union, it depends upon your son, not on me, whether or not that union ever takes place." "But it is not the only matter, and the most insurmountable barrier. There is another, greater one, that can never be surmounted," exclaimed Dr. Chadwick, incensed by the quiet dignity of Arria's reply to a degree which banished his usual soft tone and gracious manner. "Another barrier! What other can there be?" "Miss Walton, I am sorry that you have forced me to make this explanation. I hope to avoid it. That is, I desired to spare your feelings, but if you insist on knowing, if you feel yourself prepared to hear—" "I am. Please be frank and explicit with me, I entreat," replied Arria, fearfully moved by the dark forebodings that shot through her mind. "Then, Miss Walton, my dear young lady," the doctor took her hand again, but its icy coolness must have chilled him, for he instantly relinquished it. "My dear Miss Arria, you are too young to know much of the world, but you are probably aware that families of a certain standing usually desire to connect themselves with others of the same standing." An expression of relief passed over Arria's feature, and she bowed her head in token that she understood. "That is to say, Miss Walton," continued the doctor, "they would think it necessary that there should be no stain on the reputation of the family with which they connected themselves." Arria started violently, and, grasping the doctor's arm, gasped forth, "On mine? No, no, there is not. Say there is none on mine." "Be calm, my dear young lady. I earnestly entreat you will be calm. As you must hear what I am about to say one day or other, I suppose it is quite as well that you should hear it now. But be calm, pray be calm." I am. Go on, but be sure you are quite certain of what you say. Do not speak upon suspicion. Do not, for the love of heaven." "It is only on suspicion, my dear, that I can speak, but that suspicion is so strong that it amounts to a certainty. You are called the niece of Mr. Mordaunt. I have known his family since he was a child. It is almost impossible that you should be so, at least his legitimate niece. He was left early an orphan, and had but one sister and a brother, both of whom died when they were quite young, and died unmarried. If you were the child of either of them, you were—" "Spare me, spare me! Do not say that I was a child of shame. Leave me the memory of my parents to love. Mother, the image that I pictured in my mind of you, the image I have dwelt upon and loved, that has visited me in sleep, that was ever before me waking. No, no, you wrong her. My mother could never have been, her child could never have cause to blush at her memory." "Calm yourself, my dear young lady. You are dreadfully overcome. You will make yourself ill." "Tell me what grounds you have for this suspicion," questioned Arria, inspired by a momentary feeling of hope. "I have already given you sufficient grounds, but it is not my opinion that you are really the niece of Mr. Mordaunt. Your resemblance to him is so strong that it is generally supposed that you are his child."
"His child? Father? Might I then call him father? Might I love him as a father? I who have never known a father's tenderness. I have a father?"
Arria was so engrossed with having at length discovered what she had from childhood desired to know, discovered that there was a being on earth whom she might call parent, and so much tenderness awakened at this thought that she almost forgot her sorrows. When Dr. Chadwick next addressed her, it was in his softest and most conciliatory tone. "You see now, my dear, how great is the barrier between yourself and my son. I shall always esteem you and desire your welfare as I would that of a daughter, but you see how impossible it is that either his mother or myself should think of your union."
Yes, quite impossible. He could not wed the child of guilt and shame. Of guilt, of shame. Oh, am I? Can I be the child of shame? No, oh, no! She buried her face in her hands and bowed her head in an agony of tearless grief. Her frame was convulsed with strong emotion, and the cold dew burst in large drops through the fingers that were clasped against her forehead. Dr. Chadwick thought it advisable to maintain silence, until Arria gradually became calmer. Soon her limbs no longer shook, but they grew cold and rigid. She lifted her head, but when her face was uncovered, not a vestige of blood shone through the transparent skin. "It is inevitable, and I must endure it," thought she. "I have but one hope. I will see my uncle father. Can he be my father? There must be no more concealment. With God's help, I can now bear anything." She turned to Dr. Chadwick and said, "I know that it has wounded you to give me pain, but I am strong, quite strong. I can bear a great deal, therefore do not grieve for me. Do not tell Edgar that I suffered. Henceforth I must be nothing to him. I have been a source of pleasure. I should be almost happy if I thought I should not now be one of pain." "Do not trouble yourself on his account, my dear young lady. I hope he will bear these little contretemps like a man. Life is full of them. Now that I see you composed again, I may ask, will you grant me one request?" "Anything in my power," replied Arria, with almost an unnatural calmness. "You must promise not to mention this interview to my son. Do not state your motive for refusing to unite yourself to him. Of course the refusal must come from you, and tell him there is no possibility of your ever changing your mind. I have particular reasons for making this request. You will confer a great favor upon me by granting it. I have your promise?" "If, after seeing my Mr. Mordaunt, I find that the barrier does exist, then you have," replied Arria firmly. "That is sufficient. Of its existence I have satisfied myself. I beg your pardon. I did not intend to agitate you. We get accustomed to these things after living a while in the world, my dear, and the custom is second nature. I must leave you now. Keep yourself calm. Good morning." Arria returned the salutation like one in a dream. Dr. Chadwick walked out of the room without venturing to look back. She remained standing, incapable of action, in the position in which he left her. At length a step on the stairs aroused her. Quietly she passed out of the parlor, ascended the stairs, unconscious of the presence of Mrs. Lemming, who looked after her in wrathful astonishment. But Arria entered her own chamber, seated herself on her favorite little bench, and mechanically took up her work, which had fallen beside it. "My dear Arria," exclaimed Rachel in consternation, "what can have happened? You are as pale as a ghost." Arria looked up, but her features neither expressed surprise, nor pleasure, nor pain at the sight of her friend. Have you waited for me this long, long while, Rachel? Are you not tired?
You have not been gone long, my best, dearest Arria. But tell me, what has happened? What ails you? You are so fearfully changed. You look like a ghost, and your hands are colder than marble. Will you not tell me?
Not now, not yet.
But could I comfort you?
No. There is but one who can give me comfort.
And that one is Edgar?
Oh, how I wish he were here.
Arria shuddered involuntarily.
No, not Edgar. Do not speak of him. I will tell you, but not now. Soon, soon, but not yet. Some heavy affliction weighs you down, beloved Arria. How icy cold you look. Why do you not weep? It would do you good. I wish I could see you shed one tear. I cannot. It will soon pass away. Do not let it make you unhappy. You see how easily I am moved. You thought me wiser, did you not? I shall be so soon, and stronger too.
She tried to look hopeful as she spoke, but her features were too much accustomed to be the faithful index of her soul for them to obey her will. "Only tell me what I can do for you," said Rachel.
"You can only leave me. Forgive me, I have grown rude, have I not? You are so kind. Do not think me ungrateful. I shall be better alone. I am recovering already."
Rachel thought it best to obey, and, tying on her hat, for the first time she left her friend, oppressed by a grief too great for even her elasticity of spirits to throw off. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Father, dearest name of all. Sprague. Mr. Mordaunt was sitting in his gloomy parlour. A penny newspaper lay upon the table before him, but apparently he had scanned its contents. For editorials to advertisement it seemed to afford little interest. He threw the paper aside and began pacing the room, when a knock at the street door diverted his attention. It was precisely the same hour at which Mr. Badger had honoured him with a visit some weeks previous, and as Mr. Mordaunt knew there were other claims against him which might have been placed in that indefatigable gentleman's hands, the possibility of his neighbourhood instantly suggested itself. The same suspicion must have crossed the old beldame's mind as she hobbled grumblingly to open the door, for she protruded her head into the parlour and said significantly, "If it be's he, I warrant he don't get his ugly face inside the doors this time." After the usual difficulty attending unlocking and unbolting, the door was opened. Mr. Mordaunt listened with some anxiety. The first sound he heard was an ejaculation of surprise from the old woman. It was followed by a light step traversing the entry. The parlour door opened, and Arria Walton stood before him. Her first impulse was to throw herself into his arms, but he repelled her coldly, and exclaimed with even more than his usual sternness, "What brings you here? Was it not my express command that you should never cross this threshold?" Arria's cheek grew even paler than when she entered. A sudden dizziness seized her, and she would have fallen had not Mr. Mordaunt caught her rudely by the shoulder. She recovered at his touch, and at the same time regained sufficient self-possession to seat herself. "Arria, child, what ails you? Are you ill?" demanded he with less harshness.
"Child? Am I your child? They say I am. Father, may I call you by that name?" And Arria threw her arms around his neck, and, for the first time since Dr. Chadwick's visit, burst into tears.
"What do you mean? Are you mad?"
"Oh, uncle, father, beloved father, let there be no further mystery between us. You cannot know how I have longed to be blessed with a parent's love. How my heart has yearned within me to evince the devoted affection of a child! If you are indeed my father, oh, tell me so. Let me be all that a child can be to you. Am I not your child?"
"Would to God that you were!" exclaimed Mr. Mordaunt, with the first ebullition of tenderness which Arria had ever seen him display.
"Then it is false, and I am not?"
"No, you are not my child, so help me heaven."
"What am I, then? Remove this mystery, I implore you. Uncle, at least you are my uncle?"
"I will not be questioned any further," said Mr. Mordaunt, resuming his usual cold demeanour.
"It is useless to forbid me. I must question. I must know more. Have I a father? Have I a mother? Do they live? Who am I?"
"Do you dare disobey my commands?"
"I dare anything rather than suffer this terrible heart-rending fears I have endured for the last few hours. Uncle, beloved uncle, do not turn away from me. If ever I needed your kindness, I need it now. If ever you had heart for a moment grew warm towards me, do not let it now be cold. Hear me this once. It is the first time I have ever disobeyed your commands, and it shall be the last. Could you but know with what joyful heart I sprang from my bed this morning, with what heavy wretched one I now implore you to grant my request, you could not refuse. I received a visit from Dr. Chadwick today, his son, Edgar. A few days ago we have long been attached to each other, and a few days I accepted his hand. His father this morning came to me, and oh, how shall I tell you the barrier to my union with his son, which he pointed out?"
Mr. Mordaunt listened, without attempting to interrupt her, but as she spoke the last words he struck his clenched hand against his forehead, and Arria could distinctly hear the sound of his teeth grinding against one another.
"Uncle!"
"Do not call me uncle! Do not touch me! You are nothing to me, nothing! Would to God you were not! Leave me! Your presence is hateful! Your existence is a lifelong misery to me!" Mr. Mordaunt started up to leave her, but Arria followed him and threw herself at his feet.
"Answer me one question, only one. Am I a child of dishonour? Am I what most dreaded to be, what he told me I was?"
"Yes," cried Mordaunt, with demoniacal vehemence, "the child of shame, of dishonour most foul. Go, hide your face, where it can never remind me of whose child you are." With these words he rushed from the room and the house. Arria, deprived of all power, sank crouching on the floor, but though she sat there tearless, motionless, and apparently lifeless, she was not so fortunate as to forget her misery by becoming insensible. "You'd better go before he comes back, or there's no knowing what will happen," said a voice from behind her.
"Is it true, then? Is it all true?"
"It's just every word as true as if I'd spoke it myself. There's no use grieving your heart out about what can't be helped, nor never will."
"But my father and mother, tell me, if you have any compassion, are they alive?"
"Perhaps they be, perhaps they not be. It's not to me you must be coming for secrets that don't concern you. If ye just don't want to wish that your tongue was better off, you won't ask that question again. Ye best be going. Your errand's done here, and there's no help for it."
"No help indeed."
Arria had hardly breathed these words before her heart reproached her. Was there not always one source of consolation for the afflicted? Were not sufferings lightened to those who granted strength to endure them? Was there not consolation, then, to be found at the throne of the giver of all strength? Doth not he ever temper the wind to the shorn lamb? Arria wrapped her shawl about her, gathered her veil in thick folds over her face, said a few kind words to old Tabitha, who stood there shaking her head and urging her with gestures to depart, and set out to return home. She was walking up Broadway at a quick pace, and was yet at some distance from the house of Mr. Lemming, when she was unexpectedly joined by Mr. Brainard. Nothing could have been more inopportune than this encounter. Wherever he had been in company of her of late, he had always found some opportunity of pouring those sweet nothings in her ear, which it was almost impossible to misunderstand, although he never ventured to say anything of a positive nature, lest he be checked by her coldness. But coldness from Arria he had little cause to fear, for her dread of giving pain was so great that she shrank from wounding even a person whom she did not esteem. This was the first time Mr. Brainard had ever seen her alone, and, as he walked beside her, he could not forbear expressing his rapture at their meeting in the most enthusiastic language. Arria, with a strong effort, banished the thoughts that were filling her soul with dejection, and tried to converse on everyday topics. But she was wholly unused to disguise her feelings, and Brainard thought that her voice had never sounded so sweet, while its sadness moved him even more than her joyous tones had ever done. He loved Arria as truly as he was capable of loving anything but himself. Sensations were awakened in her presence which he had never before experienced. His restless, excitement-seeking disposition then seemed wholly satisfied with the object before him. He was no longer cold and calculating, and without a wish that centered not in self. She seemed to him more than all the world. He fancied that he thought her happiness of more importance than his own, and at moments he was ready to make any sacrifice which would ensure him her continued presence, and give him the one power of contributing to her felicity. So potent was her influence over him that he now lost all control over himself. Esther, Miss Adair, Mr. Badger's persecution, and Mr. Ellery's counsels were all alike forgotten. In the most passionate language he declared his love for her, conjured her at least to accord him the privilege of being near her, and of knowing that, if she granted him nothing else, she did not refuse him all hope. Of marriage he did not venture to speak. A horrible thought sometimes shot through his brain, which, in spite of his softened nature, prevented him. Might he not possess her, and yet redeem his fortunes by marrying another? His vitiated nature could not comprehend her angelic purity, even while he worshipped it, and in the excitement of passion all his wildest imagination could desire seemed possible and feasible. Arria was perfectly overwhelmed by this new misfortune, for such she could not avoid regarding it. Again and again she strove to interrupt Mr. Brainard, but her voice choked. She suffered so much herself that it only made her feel more keenly how dreadful it was to make others suffer. She had courage enough to perform any act of self-sacrifice, but not firmness sufficient to annihilate the hopes of another. Had she placed the construction upon his words which a more experienced person would have given them, her wounded dignity would have taught her to silence him with a glance, to make him cower before her, and loathe himself for conceiving so foul a project. But she was too guileless to detect guilt. In the passion of Brainard she saw everything to excite pity, and nothing that inspired anger. When she at length found voice to reply, she told him that there were circumstances connected with her history that would ever prevent her forming a matrimonial connection. She felt it her duty to add that she did not reciprocate his attachment, but on this point she touched but lightly, and concluded by entreating him to spare her in future the pain which any allusion to the subject might occasion. To a man of the world, and a man blinded by passion, the gentleness of her mien gave all the hope which her language might have destroyed. Brainard, unabashed, would have wounded her by further solicitations, had he not been interrupted by their meeting Mr. Lemming, whom Arria induced to join them. They walked the remaining distance home almost in silence. Brainard was too much excited to speak excepting on one subject. Arria feared that her lips would betray the emotions of her heart, and Mr. Lemming was habitually thoughtful and taciturn. Brainard excused himself from entering the house, but as he parted from Arria he stretched out his hand, and unwilling as she was to extend hers, she had not the heart to refuse it. Mr. Lemming's back was turned, and Brainard would have pressed her fingers to his lips, but this Arria resolutely prevented, and the reproachful look with which she accompanied her action quickly overawed him. It was long past midnight before the light was extinguished in Arria's chamber. The characters she was tracing with her pen were so often blotted out with her tears that she was more than once forced to commence anew, for, alas, her letter was to Edgar Chadwick. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Love That Is O'er and Expiring Gives Birth to a New One as Warm as Unequalled in Bliss. More. Put down that book, dear Ester. Leave the children of the Abbey, for I have something to converse with you about. Esther was lying on her bed, although it was hardly midday, wholly absorbed in the sorrows of Amanda, and in comparing that unfortunate young lady's situation to her own.
"What do you want, Rachel? You are always interrupting me in the most interesting part, but you never read. You cannot live in the ideal world in which I dwell, which I people with familiar spirits. With you all is cold reality."
All is reality, sister, but there is no coldness mingled with it, at least not towards you. How I wish I could convince you that you are injuring and destroying your mind by the species of dissipation in which you daily indulge. May it not be justly called dissipation? Does it not bear a fearful resemblance to the worst kind of inebriation? You have taught yourself to need this stimulus of your imagination as much as the inebriate needs his dram. You are miserable without it, and more miserable with it. Your body is enervated by a want of healthful exercise, and your mind enfeebled by perpetual excitement. You look upon all events of life through a false and distorted medium, and you are continually led into errors, some of which may entail lasting unhappiness upon you.
"Have you done, Rachel?" said Esther with dignity. "Methinks there is less poetry than fiction and grossness in your similes, but they pass by me like the idle wind which I respect not."
I feared as much, yet I hope for this once you will not turn a deaf ear to my counsel. Sister, you are under some strange delusion concerning young Chadwick, and I fear the consequence. To my certain knowledge, Edgar is the suitor of Arria Walton, and not yours.
"'Tis ever thus that I am persecuted, the envy of others, and their dread that I shall return the affection lavished upon me, embitter my life."
What envy can there be in this case, Esther? I tell you the simple truth, and my only motive is to save you from committing yourself through misinterpretation of the intentions of Mr. Chadwick.
"Who shall judge our motives?" ejaculated Esther, showing a considerable portion of the white part of her eyes as she looked supplicatingly upward.
"Then you will not believe me?"
"I believe nothing but what my own heart tells me, what the guardian spirits hovering about me whisper in my ears. That I believe, and that only."
Rachel was at a loss of what further to say. It was impossible to convince her sister of her error. Yet the delusion under which she was laboring might entail the most disagreeable consequences. "Esther," resumed she, "Mr. Chadwick is coming here this afternoon. Bring the sketch I desired he would procure me. I beg you will see him and endeavor to discover whether or not I have spoken falsely to you. Will you do this?"
"I will see him, will listen to him, but the words which he will breathe are already engraven on my heart. But I love him. In the face of the world I avow him, and only him. That he has long secretly loved me, and that I have known it, I can never deny."
"If he has loved you, why should he love secretly? Why has he not offered himself?"
"His noble nature forbade it. Fate, ever blind in bestowing her gifts, has denied him wealth, while she has made me rich as a fairy's wand could have commanded. He feared to ask my hand, lest the tongue of calumny should whisper that he sighed not for it alone. I have long seen his heart, and his generosity shall be rewarded."
"Beware what you do, Esther."
"I am aware. Love is often unwary, but my love is under the guidance of wisdom. Interrupt me no longer, sister. You have called me back from the world of fiction to a world that is unblessed by rainbow hues. I sicken of your false counsels, therefore do not disturb me again."
Esther resumed her book, and tears, which never coursed from her cheeks for the real sorrows of many a poor wretch whom her bounty might have succored, were soon streaming from her eyes for the ideal griefs of ideal beings. Rachel knew that it was useless to argue with her, and left the room to assist in her mother's household occupations. That mother, from whom her exertions seldom met an approving word, in whose ear she longed but dared not to breathe how tenderly she loved her. Twice during that morning Edgar Chadwick had called at Mrs. Lemming's. It was the day succeeding the one which had brought Arria so many trials. On neither occasion could he gain admittance. The answer he received was that the ladies were particularly engaged. He requested to see Miss Walton, but it was Mrs. Lemming's order that the same reply should be made to his demand. Surprised and vexed, he determined to call upon the Clintons this afternoon, with the sketch he had procured for Rachel, for he hoped to receive some explanation of Arria's conduct from them, or at least to send her a message through Rachel. He found Esther in the parlor alone, finishing the last thrilling page of The Children of the Abbey. Rachel was not at home. Esther started up, joyfully extending her hand, and then hung down her head, as though she hoped her loosely flowing hair would conceal her glowing cheeks. Mr. Chadwick was so much accustomed to her manner that it did not in the least surprise him. He seated himself beside her, wholly unconscious of the tender glances which ever and anon assailed him.
"Your looks are serious," said Esther. "Have you any cause of grief?"
"Am I serious?" rejoined Edgar, with a livelier air. "Well, I suppose my telltale looks are only proclaiming my thoughts. I was thinking it was a very pleasant thing to get married, but a very vexatious one to have to wait half one's life." Esther looked as though she thought this a proper occasion to blush, and perhaps her color did vary slightly as she replied,
"That vexation should never be yours, and Hymen should come to you crowned with roses of joy."
"But Hymen is determined to approach me only on crutches, and I, being of a rather impatient disposition, am somewhat annoyed at the slowness of his pace."
"Would it not be a happiness to you to know that your love was returned, more than returned?"
"I should not be a stoic if it were not."
"Then be happy," murmured Esther,
scanning the pattern of the carpet. "And so I am, but it does not prevent my regretting that circumstances so often forbid my beholding the lady of my love."
"She ever desires to see you," replied Esther tenderly.
"Does she? I thank her for that as heartily as I wish that all her desires could be accomplished. You are very good, Miss Esther, to take such interest in this affair of mine, and I have a request to make, which your kindness leads me to think you will not refuse."
"Refuse? I can refuse you nothing. Make not your request," she continued, with unwonted energy. "I have divined it already granted it, Edgar. Your noble, generous heart has long made you fearful of breathing your wishes, but now feeling will give its way, and you can no longer be silent. All that you would ask is granted unasked. My heart has long been yours, my hand henceforth shall be."
Esther hid her face with one hand and laid the other on the open palm of Mr. Chadwick. Wonderstruck, perplexed, and alarmed, he knew not how to reply, and was withdrawing his hand, but her warm grasp prevented him. The momentary silence was interrupted by Esther.
"Have I overstepped the bounds of maidenly modesty by this confession?" said she. "No, I feel I have not done so. You feared to demand my hand because that hand belonged to an heiress, and I am blessed by fate that permitted me to bestow wealth upon you by offering it."
"How the plague shall I get out of this dilemma?" thought Chadwick. "The girl is certainly possessed. Who could have foreseen such a denouement?"
"Your feelings overcome you, and you are silent," said Esther, half reproachfully.
"Miss Clinton, I am very sorry. You have placed me in a very difficult situation. I have always had a great esteem for you, but—"
"But you are afraid of being misconstrued by the world, the harsh, judging, censorious world, preventing your confessing it."
"Not so. I earnestly desire not to wound your feelings, but I must undeceive you."
"The heart we love, and that loves us, is easiest wounded. But your words, Edgar, are all too dear to me for them to give pain. Speak freely, as though you are but whispering your thoughts to yourself. What am I but your other self?"
"This is a species of insanity," thought Edgar, "and I must deal with her, even though as I would deal with an insane person. The lesson she must now receive may cure her forever. This is my first case, to be sure, and I am practicing without a diploma, but there is no mistaking the medicine." He turned to Esther and said, with less consideration than before, "Miss Clinton, you have deceived yourself. That neither my words nor actions could have deceived you, I feel certain. I had no intention of requesting your hand or winning your affections. My own affections have long been engaged to Miss Walton, and I presumed you were aware of the fact."
"Arria! Arria!" almost shrieked Esther. "Have you brought this misery upon me? What sorcery has she used? Tell me, when was it that she robbed me of your heart, the heart that was mine but is so no more?"
"Miss Walton has possessed my affections since I first became acquainted with her."
"And you dare tell me so? You dare triumph over me, sir, after having so fearfully deceived me?"
exclaimed Esther with irrepressible excitement.
"Man, man, know you not that woman's love may turn to the deadliest hate? Then know it now. As I loved you once, so now I hate you. Leave my presence. Never again offend my sight. Go hence, and may the memory of the heart you have broken follow you and strew thorns in your way.
I will leave you as soon as you desire, Miss Clinton. Believe me, I sincerely regret the occurrence of this afternoon. You have the promise of a man of honor that not a word that has passed between us shall ever be repeated. When we meet again, I hope that all will be forgotten, and that you will extend to me the hand of friendship. Good afternoon."
"He is gone,"
ejaculated Esther, as the doors closed upon him.
"Cruel, cruel! He is left the victim of his arts to weep over his deception."
She threw herself upon the couch, and shed tears of mortified vanity. Her feelings had received a great shock, but the spell was not yet broken. She had fed her mind with romance until she considered herself a heroine, and on that subject was in reality a monomaniac. Could she have reflected rationally on her own conduct, Mr. Chadwick's rebuke would have had a beneficial influence. But she saw his actions in the false light of her imagination, and looked upon herself as the most injured of beings. Esther was still bemoaning her fate, and canvassing the propriety of revenging herself upon her imaginary lover, when the street bell rang, and in answer to its summons, Mr. Brainard was admitted. Brainard had twice that morning escaped a reconnoitre with Mr. Badger, once by shutting himself in his own clothes-press, and a second time by jumping into an omnibus as he perceived his inconvenient acquaintance approaching him. These narrow escapes had quite driven Arria out of his head, although not from his heart, and he was determined to hear his fate from the lips of Miss Esther that very night. A more opportune moment for forwarding his suit could hardly have presented itself. The wound in Esther's heart, created by the loss of a false lover, could only be healed by the balm applied by a true one. Esther received Mr. Brainard with unusual demonstrations of pleasure. He quickly entered upon the subject nearest, not to his heart, but to his pocket, and, in a few moments more, might have been an accepted lover, had not the entrance of Rachel and Mrs. Clinton prevented Esther's rendering him happy by her answer. Tea was served, and Mr. Brainard took a seat by Esther's side, but he found no opportunity of resuming the subject for a second time, so unfortunately broken off. Rachel was just pouring out a third cup for Mr. Brainard, when a servant informed him that a gentleman at the door, a friend of Mr. Brainard's, he called himself, desired to see him immediately. Poor Brainard's complexion varied perceptibly at this intelligence. The only friend he dreaded seeing, it surely be he.
"Won't you invite him in?" said the hospitable Miss Clinton. "If his visit is one of business, the back parlor is at your service." "Oh, no, I thank you, no," said Brainard, rising hastily. "It is not anybody at all, nobody of consequence. I cannot imagine who it can be." But Brainard had imagined, and when he reached the street door, he found that he had imagined correctly.
"How do you do, my dear fellow? Delighted to see you. Been looking for you all over town," exclaimed Mr. Badger at the highest pitch of his stentorian voice. "Thought I'd find you here. Pretty girl I saw you with in Broadway, eh? Fine eyes, fine woman. Affairs getting on well? Courtship slow work. Must make haste. Women like you, all the better going ahead with dispatch, eh?"
"My dear Mr. Badger," said Brainard in the most conciliatory tone, "I heard that you called my rooms this morning. I was really very sorry to miss you. You have taken a great deal of trouble to come this distance, but really you must excuse me at present."
No trouble at all, my dear fellow. Business never troubles me. Prefer calling at a house where there's a pretty girl. How is she, eh? Mr. Badger, if you do not wish to ruin me—
"Will you not invite your friend to walk in, Mr. Brainard?" said Mrs. Clinton, whose old-fashioned ideas of civility made it incumbent upon her to entertain all the visitors of her own visitors. "Walk in, sir, will you not?"
"Much obliged to you. Very happy, your ladyship," said Badger, before Brainard could prevent him. "Very happy to make your acquaintance. How's your ladyship's daughter? Beautiful girl, charming girl, fine eyes. Had the pleasure of being introduced to you by my friend Brainard, particular friend of mine."
Mrs. Clinton looked astonished at the extraordinary ease and self-possession of Mr. Badger, and Brainard, almost beside himself, drew the lady's arm within his, reconducted her without her own consent into the parlor, and whispered, "Pray do not be alarmed. There is something wrong with this individual here." He touched his forehead, "but he is quite harmless. Do not be alarmed." He turned hastily to rejoin Mr. Badger, and found him already at the parlor door. "Come with me into the entry. I have a few words to say to you in private," said Mr. Brainard, smothering with difficulty his rising wrath.
"But, my dear fellow, it would be very rude for me to refuse this lady's invitation. Never refuse invitations from a lady." Mr. Badger winked his eye significantly. "'Twon't do. Always offend them. Make it a rule never to offend a lady."
"I will answer for it that Mrs. Clinton shall not be offended, and I must speak with you." Brainard forced his friends nearer to the street door, and then continued, "If nothing goes wrong, I shall be married in the course of a month. All your claims will be cancelled. Will that not content you?"
"Me? Certainly. Most easily contented man in the country. Great country. But Delmonico, my dear fellow, Delmonico won't wait, never waits, must have his money, like the old Jew in the play, must have his money. Ever seen Shylock and Portia? Sublime. Must go see Macready. Fine play, fine fellow. Great fella, sublime."
"Only leave me now, Badger. A thought has struck me. I think I may see a way of paying you speedily. You spoke of Jews. If it is possible for me to borrow any money, and there are Jews in the city who lend, you shall be paid without further delay."
"Must make it possible, my dear fellow. Faith makes everything possible. Great thing. Must have faith. Nothing like it."
I have. Good evening. Call at my rooms." Brainard had, by this time, dexterously managed to get his friend upon the stoop, and, breaking away from him, suddenly closed the street door in his face. He waited a few moments in the entry, fearing that Badger's pertinacity of character might induce him to ring the bell for the sake of making some further inquiry. A low chuckle and the noise of unequal footsteps descending from the porch were the only sounds that met his ear, and once more he re-entered the parlor. The excitement produced by Mr. Badger's visit rendered him desperate. Without even attempting to escape observation, he drew Miss Ester to the window, and declared himself to be her adorer, entreated that she would immediately put an end to his suspense. He did not add that he requested an instant reply because he had somebody else in view, but as the thought often crossed his mind, and he was so much bewildered that he hardly knew what he was saying, he ran some risk of making a similar confession. Esther's answer was all that he could have desired, and something more. She promised to be his, eternally his, to love him alone, and to remain ever by his side,
and to find her whole happiness in his presence. Brainard returned home singing that night, and never once changed the notes to a whistle until he thought of Arria Walton. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Unheedful vows may be heedfully broken. Shakespeare. The unpleasantness of Edgar Chadwick's visit to the Clintons only made him more anxious to behold Arria. A word from her sweet lips could cancel all the disagreeable impressions, remove all the uneasiness, and by magical influence speedily restore his cheerfulness. He determined to talk again upon the lemmings, and insist upon seeing Miss Walton. Short, because it was made with the hasty steps of expectation, brought him to Mr. Lemming's door. An Irishwoman, a simple-hearted creature, answered the summons of the bell. As soon as she saw who desired admittance, she saluted him with, "Och, Mr. Chadwick, is it yourself? It's right glad I am to see you, and it's been watching for you all the afternoon I was. The missus left word that she was too busy to see you in case you called. But there's Miss Arria, Lord love her, and bless her beautiful face. Sure the like of it never smiled upon a poor body before at all. Miss Arria, she kind of knew you'd come, and Biddy, she says to me, 'Good Biddy, it's always good Biddy with the sweet soul. It's Mr. Chadwick comes tonight. Do you just manage to open the door for him and contrive to slip this here little letter into his hand for my sake, and never lisp a word of it about the house, Biddy, for it's you I can trust and nobody else, God bless her.' Those were just the words she spoke. And so I will, miss, says I, for there's nobody. But the letter, give me the letter, good woman. No matter for your answer. Where's the letter? Why, sure, here it is, if I haven't lost it. I puts it in my pocket and goes downstairs, and never thought to see if it was safe till this blessed minute. But it is safe, is it not? What on earth makes you wear such a sack of a pocket? Said Chadwick impatiently, as Bridget's arm, up to the very elbow, disappeared in her capacious pocket, from which she had not yet extracted the precious document. "Och, it's because I've a power of things to keep in it, be sure. Faith and troth, then, the letter's gone. No, here it is. No, it aren't neither. It's the missus' paper of chamomile flowers. Ah, now here it is safe enough. I knew it by the little blue seal." Edgar snatched the letter, hurriedly thanked the woman, and was turning away when he remembered that there might be something even more acceptable to her than thanks, and slipped $50 into her hand. "Thank ye, sir, thank ye. That's a rare gentleman Miss Arria's got for her spark, at all events. The Lord prosper ye both. I shan't forget to tell Miss Arria that it's just—" Edgar did not hear the conclusion of her sentence, for he was already rapidly pursuing his way towards home. The letter was in his hand, and he found it impossible to walk the whole distance to Waverley Place without at least taking a glimpse at its contents. He stepped beneath the street lamp, broke the seal, and unfolded the letter. It contained several pages, closely written, in a delicate, but here and there irregular, almost illegible hand, as though the feelings of the writer had varied as she wrote. He hastily refolded the sheets, more impatient than ever for the seclusion of his own chamber. That chamber he entered in 10 minutes more. The door was locked, a candle lighted, and the letter in his hand. He opened it, again and again, touched the impress of that dear hand to his lips, and, with a light and a hopeful heart, seated himself and read as follows. "How shall I begin to write you, beloved Edgar? How shall I ever find the words to communicate to you tidings which have weighed so heavily on my own heart that I dread no future trial so much as transferring a portion of their weight to yours?
Nerve yourself, and be strong. With what fortitude, were it needful, would you not endure the most excruciating physical operation? Prepare yourself with equal courage to bear this unavoidable mental affliction. A few days ago, only a few days ago, I promised you to become your wife. And oh, how much more than wife I promised myself to be to you. But I dare not dwell over the blissful past. The past it is indeed, for the happiness of those hours can never return. The tender title of wife can never be mine. Thank God, I have written the worst. You know all. Yes, I who but yesterday so fondly pictured the sunny future to your enchanted eyes, I whose thoughts were so pregnant with bright prospects and brighter hopes, whose lips were so full of tenderness, whose heart so replete with the first passionate devotion with which it had ever inspired, I whose hand but last night returned the pressure of yours with all the warmth of happy love, with that very hand I today trace the unalterable words, I can never be yours. The barrier to our union can never be surmounted, or whence the knowledge of it came, I can never even reveal to you. Your most urgent entreaties could not force me to do so, for there is a vow against it, already registered in heaven. Bear with firmness the misfortunes that are not only allotted to you for a wise end. I should be more resigned if I could but know that you were firm. All hope is not taken from us. One last lingering ray yet throws its light over the far distant future, though the darkness of despair lies between. How short is this life? How long eternity? How short a space, then, can our spirits be separated? For how long, O one, may they be reunited in the world to which we are journeying? Alas, in the existence of that world you hardly believe, and you deny yourself. How great a consolation! Edgar, beloved Edgar, there is one grief greater to me than the certainty that I must resign you forever, far greater than the knowledge that all my earthly dreams of happiness are dispelled, and then even greater than the anguish of knowing that I have made you miserable. It is the grief which overwhelms me when I remember that I shall not be permitted to converse with you daily, to present holy truths to your mind, to lead your thoughts to the contemplation of your Creator, to hear you at length acknowledge his existence, his perfect goodness, and his boundless mercy, and yield him the homage of an adoring spirit. Something of this grief you can spare me. It is my last request, Edgar, for my sake, if not for your own. You cannot refuse it. The universal end, the end of all things in creation, is that there may be an eternal conjunction of the Creator with his creatures. In order that this conjunction may take place, we must elevate our minds to him and purify our spirits, that they may become recipients of his goodness and wisdom. Our minds we cannot thus elevate to God unless we seek and find him. You, Edgar, have not found him because you have not sought. My only petition to you is that you will seek him now, that you will look for the proofs of his existence, not in this external world alone, nor in the starry worlds whose wonderful periodical motions he orders and controls. Look for him in the yet more wonderful workings of the immortal soul, and you will find him there, perfectly manifested as everywhere. Can the philosopher ask a nobler study? All religion must be based on philosophy, or its foundation is in the sand. You will perhaps answer me, but how am I to believe that there is such a thing as that soul of which you speak? I have never yet seen the evidence of such existence. I only see that our perceptions are derived through our senses, which are material,
and that the will which guides our action proceeds from the workings of the brain, animated by a vital principle which, being extinguished, causes us to expire. I reply that of the existence of the soul you may readily convince yourself. In cases of natural or induced somnambulism, of which thousands of instances are daily occurring around us, the body is deprived of all sensation, and the material senses are completely closed. Yet the soul feels, thinks, wills, and internally acts. It perceives by means of spiritual senses, and in some states has intercourse with spirits. Distances are annihilated, and the spiritual vision perceives objects too far removed to be visible to the keenest natural sight. These facts have long and too well been authenticated for the determined skepticism reasonably to deny them. If you admit them, you must admit that the workings of the brain are caused by the spirit or soul, and that the vital principle of which you speak is that spirit or soul, and cannot be extinguished, although it may be separated from its fleshly covering, the body, when that covering becomes disorganized and useless. All that I ask is that you will thoroughly investigate these subjects, rejecting nothing that appears marvelous and incomprehensible, until you have satisfied yourself that it is a delusion, and that the learned and wise men who received it as truth were deluded. Will you pardon me if I say a word on the subject of faith? The other evening I heard you say, "It may be very unfortunate, but I am not blessed with faith." If you are not, it is indeed unfortunate. A celebrated theologian gives the following definition of faith. Faith is an affectation for truth, arising from the love of truth, for truth's sake. Are you indeed without this affection, Edgar? I think not. One more word, and I have finished. The Bible. Read it, I entreat you. If it only be a study, yet read it. From the natural or literal sense of its contents, which first reaches the understanding, you will learn much, and gradually, as your mind becomes enlightened, through reverence and affection for those contents, its spiritual meaning will become apparent to you. You will feel that its writers were inspired, and that it is indeed the Word of God, by the means of which men have communicated with heaven. You may perhaps think it strange that I should choose such a painful moment to write on subjects of this nature, but reflect, dearest Edgar, of how much importance I esteem these subjects. Remember that these lines may be the last that I shall ever address to you, and you will pardon me. I look upon this world as the vestibule, where we must fit ourselves for heaven. What wonder, then, that I should earnestly desire that your soul should be so molded that the sphere which I humbly hope would be heaven to me should not be less so to you. I have finished, and as I call to mind your superiority of intellect, your strength of character, and the talents for which you are distinguished, I am surprised at myself for daring to usurp the place of counselor. Ah, Edgar, that place I shall never again hold. Let me not have forced myself into this once in vain. And now I must write that most dreaded and doubly sad word, farewell. I may not add, think of me, but rather forget me, and forget that you ever loved me. To hear that you are happy will be some alleviation of my sorrow. When time has healed the wound now so fresh in your heart, you will marry, at least I hope you will, and then I may sometimes venture to be near you and rejoice in your well-being. As for myself, I will never be a wife, shall never love another, although, henceforth, I must force myself to love you as a sister. Farewell. My pen pauses at the word. There is so much more I would say, but no, it would only add to your sorrow. Farewell. May heaven soon grant you the love of another and worthier being, whose devotion may equal, and if possible, surpass that of your Arria. Good God!" faltered Chadwick, as he finished the last line. "Do I not dream? Arria rejects me, gives me no reason, refuses to state the obstacle. What am I to think? And yet, what pure and perfect love she evinces! How she restrains her own feelings for fear of paining me! How generous, self-sacrificing! How full of wise goodness is every line!" Chadwick reperused a portion of the letter, and his eyes filled to overflowing. In a moment he hastily brushed away the moisture. "What weakness is that? I will see her. She must see me. She must explain. And there is no obstacle which I will not surmount. She shall be yet mine. The jewel is too priceless for me to relinquish it. She cannot resist my entreaties. No, no. Lovely, perfect, too angelic Arria! I can learn your beautiful faith from no lips as well as from thy pure ones, and they must not refuse to teach me." End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. They name thee before me, a knell to mine ear. Byron. "The wisest and best men," says a German author, "whose schemes are the grandest and whose hopes the highest, are most liable to disappointment." It was probably upon the truth of this sentiment that Mr. Badger was reflecting, as he sat in his dark and dusty little office near the Exchange, making out a list of friends who, in spite of his vigilant exertions, had managed to absent themselves during his memory-refreshing visits. Conspicuously upon his list stood forth the name of Mr. Eustace Mordaunt. Mr. Badger pointed with his long, bony forefinger at that name, and gravely soliloquized, "This won't do. Doing justice to the public. Called there twice this week. Old woman said deaf never hears my knock. Promised to fork out the shiners 2 days ago. No escape." Having thus expressed himself, he took up his hat with an air of a man determined to do his duty, and sallied forth, his countenance exhibiting that self-satisfied cheerfulness that usually characterized it when engaged in pursuing his aim. Mr. Mordaunt sometime had business in Wall Street, so had Mr. Badger always. The latter gentleman was so intimately acquainted with all the dark nooks and corners of this busy thoroughfare that, like Byron, he was often alone amid the crowd, an unobserved and contemplative observer of the actions and passions of his fellow men. Whether or not he had the faculty of rendering himself invisible we cannot say, but it is quite certain that about an hour after he left his office, Mr. Mordaunt, who happened to be thoughtfully walking down Wall Street at this time, was suddenly startled by a hand cordially stretched out to grasp his, and the apparition of a jocose face unexpectedly smiling in front of him, as only those who have accomplished some darling purpose can smile. "Ah, Mordaunt, my dear Even Mr. Badger, with all his fluency of tongue, could hardly finish that familiar word addressed to the cold and stately individual who stood frowning before him. "Delighted to meet you. Called twice at your house. Old lady so deaf she can't hear my knock. Better get rid of her. How's t'other one, eh? Mean the black-eyed one that won't wear a bit of comb in all that sublime hair of hers. Fine woman, only too pale." A change, almost appalling, passed over the features of Mr. Mordaunt as Badger spoke these last words. His usually colorless cheeks and white lips grew livid, his eyes became distended, and the orbs rolled wildly in their sockets. Quick and gasping came his thickened breath, and every limb, whose position had before been so full of majestic haughtiness, quivered and shook as with an ague. Mr. Badger was more awed by the horror depicted in the lineaments before him than he had ever been when rage and defiance usurped its place. "Hush!" whispered Mordaunt, and the sound seemed strangely prolonged, for it was the only one he could utter. Certainly, rejoined Badger, resuming his former lively and easy deportment. "Never lisp a word about the lady in the garret. Oh, you sober-faced old sinner," added he in a bantering tone, "who'd suspect how you amused yourself at home, eh? Don't forget to present my compliments. Sorry you didn't introduce me." "Have I not warned you, at your peril, never again to mention the subject? Never, while you live, mention it, even to yourself, unless you would have evil befall you." "Say no more. Some folks don't mind talking about their little harum-scarum scrapes, and some folks always keep 'em close." Mr. Mordaunt did not reply, and his friend continued jocosely, "But I didn't think it of you. I didn't never suspected it. You're a jolly fellow, as cunning about shutting the girls up in the garret as any deluder of 'em all." "By heaven, this is too much! Mr. Badger, if you have any consideration up for yourself, if you do not wish to incense me beyond all endurance, to set me mad," vociferated Mordaunt, losing all self-possession, "you will never allude to that unfortunate being again. You have once given me your promise, and I believed—" "Say no more. 'Nough said. Never mention her name. That's to say, after I know it." "Your business with me, Mr. Badger, was concerning that little bill in your hand?" Exactly. Hit the nail on the head that time. Never trouble any friends about business until they are quite ready. Always study their convenience. Make it a rule, my dear fellow, make it a rule." Before Badger finished speaking, Mr. Mordaunt had taken out a well-worn but slenderly filled pocket-book and placed its contents in Mr. Badger's hand. "It will not make up the whole account, but it is every dollar I have. It must content you. In a few days I have the prospect of receiving a sum of money which has been some time due for lawyers' fees. You shall then be satisfied." "Difficulty about getting in the shiners, eh? Don't let that distress you. Put the bills in my hands. I'll collect it, no fear. They'll pay me. Everybody pays me. I'll do the business for you." "That is impossible, for I should then lose the chance of being again employed. And now, Mr. Badger, I wish you a very morning. I believe our roads lie in different directions." Mr. Mordaunt passed on, and Mr. Badger stood looking after him, shaking his head demurely and muttering to himself, "Who'd have thought it of the old chap? Who'd have thought it? Never suspected him. Last man in the world. All alike, sober chaps, no better than the rattle-pates. The women play the devil with 'em all." Convinced of this fact, Mr. Badger proceeded to make a few calls upon the wives and daughters of the gentleman whose name he kept in his memorandum book. He invariably found it a good policy to have an interview with the female portion of the family, and engage their services in influencing the male to reward his assiduity. Perhaps there was sometimes no small portion of selfishness on the part of the ladies who undertook to promote his views, for the visits of Mr. Badger were by no means short or few, and he had a method of his own of gaining admittance exactly at the very moment when his presence created the greatest sensation, not to say disturbance. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Viens donc essayer les dossiers d'une passion sans orage. Madame de Waleska. Edgar Chadwick was possessed of a disposition which could not be depressed by opposition to his wishes, so long as there was a remote possibility of surmounting that opposition by his own exertions. He was naturally frank, straightforward, and incapable of disguising either his feelings or his intentions. When he found he could not obtain an interview with Arria by calling at her residence, he instantly took his way to that part of the city in which there was most likelihood of his meeting Mr. Lemming. When he found him, he explained his situation, read him a few passages from Arria's letter, and requested that he procure him an interview with her. Mr. Lemming did not seem to be surprised at his young friend's communications until he stated that he had several times been denied admittance by the order of Mrs. Lemming. The cheek of the kind old man flushed, and his eyes sparkled, but he only replied, "It was without my knowledge. I assure you it was without my knowledge." "I felt convinced that was so, sir," returned Chadwick, "and therefore I take the liberty of begging you, if you are so disengaged, to accompany me to the house, that I may thus gain admission, for I must see Arria this very day." "I fear she is immovable," replied Mr. Lemming, "but I will do as you desire, and at least you shall see her. That is all I ask, although if you could inform me of the cause of which induced her to take this sudden resolution, I should be greatly indebted to you." "You must not question me, my dear young friend. I am only partially acquainted with Arria's motive, but you may feel assured that she is not a woman who would take such a decisive step from impulse, and that she has decided in this case after mature deliberation." "I hope to prove that her decision is not unalterable," replied Edgar. The two gentlemen exchanged but few remarks until they reached the house. Mr. Lemming opened the door with a night key, ushered his companion into the parlour, and went to see Arria. Edgar, in spite of himself, was every instant becoming more agitated, but not many minutes were allowed for him to calm himself before Mr. Lemming had scarcely disappeared before Arria entered. She came forward with unfaltering steps, and extended her hand with her wonted cordiality, and yet without her unwonted warmth and tenderness. The smile, too, that welcomed him, had all its former sweetness, but none of its former gaiety. Her cheek was paler than Edgar had ever beheld it, and betokened inward suffering. Her eyes, those soft, dark orbs, that until now had ever sparkled so brightly at his coming, were heavy and downcast, as though their lids were charged with unshed tears. Yet her whole countenance was serene, and her manners were perfectly calm. "Arria, mine own Arria," exclaimed Edgar the instant he beheld her, "I have come to tell you that no obstacle shall separate us, that I cannot, will not release you from your promise, and that I shall pardon you the wretched night you occasioned to speak me, when you bid me forget you ever dealt so lightly with my happiness as to write that cruel letter." "Edgar, Mr. Chadwick," faltered Arria, "I had hoped that you would spare yourself this meeting. I can only repeat what I have already said, and that it is quite as painful for me to speak as you to hear." "But you will not hold to your resolution, dearest Arria. If you ever loved me, as you once made me too happy by saying you did, you will not trifle with me thus. You will not sacrifice my peace, my hopes, my—" "I am weak, Edgar. Do not try me," interrupted Arria. "You can add to my grief, but you cannot shake my resolution. Your wife I can never be, never will be. I have said it. Nothing in this world can alter my determination." As she spoke these last words, there was so much firmness, even severity, in her tone, so much determination in her air, that Edgar's heart sank within him. "At least you cannot refuse me an explanation. What obstacle can there be which I can find insurmountable?" "Do you doubt my words, or easily forget them, Edgar, as to question? Have I not told you that the obstacle was one which I could never reveal?
Forgive me, my best beloved. I had not forgotten it. Nay, do not withdraw your hand. There is a time when it lay in mine untrembling. Tell me, Arria, how many days is it since the night you promised that thus, hand in hand, we would brave all life's ills together? Arria's feelings were too much harrowed by the question for her to reply. Her lover saw the advantage he had hoped to gain, and felt that this was the propitious moment. With the fever of hope, he seized the hand she had withdrawn, and said, I must know, dearest, I must. Better for you to break the vow you have made, than for you to ensure my wretchedness by keeping it. Tell me this obstacle to our union. That were impossible. Edgar, is it kind of you to thus test my firmness of purpose? The vow I have made can never be broken. You were not so scrupulous in breaking the vow which was previously made to me, returned Edgar hastily. Tears sprang into Arria's eyes when she heard the cruel reproach, but she forced them back before they were observed by Edgar. Of a sudden it occurred to him that the objection which his father had offered to the union, Arria's probable illegitimacy, might have been communicated to her, and induced her to make her present resolve. It was a delicate subject on which to speak, and, if she was ignorant of the world's suspicions, he ran the great risk of wounding her. Yet it was necessary for him to unravel this mystery, and the chance of paining her was only equal to that of permanently alleviating her sufferings. Dearest, he said in a low and tender tone, can you not conceive that I may be acquainted with this impediment? Does it you through your parents? Arria could scarcely repress the shriek that was ready to burst from her lips. The agitation she evinced alarmed Edgar, while it convinced him that he was right in his surmise. He attempted to support her, but she extricated herself from his grasp and said, I could have borne to hear others say it. I have borne it more calmly. But from you, Edgar, the blow comes with double violence. It is no blow. Look up, my Arria. I esteem it no obstacle. The misfortune of others shall not be a barrier to our felicity. Say that it shall not. And since I declare that there is no obstacle to my making a pure and spotless being, such as you are, my wife, only tell me that you consent to renew your promise. Whisper that one word, and all will be well. I do not consent. I can never consent, replied Arria, all the emotion that she had heretofore evinced suddenly vanishing. That I am a child of shame, you know, and yet you do not know all. But that is sufficient. The woman who you call wife must be one that you can present to the world without a blush, who can mingle among your friends, who can be received into the bosom of your family. If she were other, she must interfere with your prospects in life, and the brilliancy of your career would be checked by the very hand that should promote it. My resolution, I once more repeat, is unalterable. Every effort you make to shake it inflicts a new wound, but one which I should bear unmoved. This must be the last time that you make any attempt to influence me. If I have cause to think that it will not be, I must shun your presence, and thus secure myself. My strength is failing me, and I must leave you. Edgar, do not make yourself miserable by unavailing regrets. Be composed, be resigned. I have bowed my head to the affliction. Do you bend yours. God give you comfort. I have none to offer you. Adieu. Edgar was alone and baffled, heart-stricken, almost unmanned. It was not his nature to despair, yet what hope could he cling? I cannot give her up, he said to himself as he left the house. That is impossible. Yet what can I do? Sages are right, and our hopes are but bubbles and thistledown. They sink softly into the heart, yet are blown away by passing breath. it may be never, through our utmost exertions, to be recalled. End of chapter 12.